Hello, students. Welcome again to another in our series of lectures regarding the Culture and Values 8th edition textbook used in your class in Humanities. We're now looking at Chapter 10, The High Middle Ages, the Search for Synthesis. As we've mentioned earlier, the Middle Ages is appropriately named. In the past, it was referred to as the Dark Ages, but that's really not accurate at all. It had its high times as well as its low times, but this is by high Middle Ages, we mean later in the Middle Ages when it reached its zenith. We want to look now at this particular map because much of the High Middle Ages concerns this particular part of the world, and particularly what's referred to here as the Ile-de-France. Literally means the island of France. It's one of 26 administrative regions of France comprising mostly of the Paris metropolitan area. So even though that's still a very famous city today, it was during this period of history that Paris really takes prominence in the world. This Ile-de-France was created as a district of the Paris region, actually in 1961, but it goes back obviously much further than that. It was renamed as the Ile-de-France or region in 1976 when its administrative status was aligned with the other French administrative regions created in 1972. So this is a long-standing area here in France. Despite the name change, Ile-de-France is still popularly referred to by the French people as the Région Parisienne, or the Paris region, or sometimes abbreviated with the letters RP. 90% of its territory is covered by the Paris metropolitan area, which extends beyond its borders in various places. Let's talk about the significance of Paris. It really became the center of Western civilization during the years 1150 to 1300 AD. It was well known for its Gothic architecture and the lead it took in Gothic architecture, which is still very popular even to this day. It's known for scholasticism, which we'll get more into detail later. The university, the beginnings of the modern day university, and I think you're going to be surprised at some of the reasons for that. It had a distinct cultural expression. The rediscovery of the classical texts, and by classical we mean the Greco-Roman culture, what we find in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and they were responsible for rediscovering these texts, which ironically were really preserved more by the Muslims pre-Middle Ages, but they're discovered here and they're used very much in the universities of the time. Remember that during the Middle Ages there was very much a Judeo-Christian worldview. God was considered the center of everything. And even though that was the case, we do see a number of religious reforms during this time. But even at that, the thought was God is the center, all knowledge leads to knowing God. So even when they're going back and rediscovering the works of Plato and Aristotle here, and many of the other Greek writers and Roman writers in these classical texts, it was still thought that this would ultimately lead one to God, that even in these pagan writers, there was, as scripture says, he has not left them without a witness. There was still evidence there of the God who made them. Let's talk about the Gothic style now, specifically St. Denis. Abbot Suger, 1080 through 1151, is a significant player here. St. Denis and Charlemagne. Now, these particular individuals are significant because they are thought to have relics here that were thought to be delivered by Charlemagne. Now, you'll recall relics are very important because these have great spiritual and religious significance, and they also attract many pilgrims. The crude way to say that would be tourists, but they wouldn't refer to them that way, but people would come from miles around to see these things. So these places really became the pilgrimage destination. These people would once again come from near and far to see these particular objects. So this is very important. We want to mention the Lindit. By the Lindit, it was a big trade fair that was held near the Abbey. Now, this obviously couldn't be held inside the Abbey. This was thought to be too much of a secular event. But these trade fairs cashed in, so to speak, on all of these pilgrims that would make the journey to see these particular destinations, specifically for the reason of seeing these relics. Significant cathedrals would be the Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia would literally mean the Church of Holy Wisdom. This was thought to be on the same level of the Temple of Solomon. This is a remarkable, an absolutely remarkable structure, and we'll have the time to look at some pictures of that later. It has a place, of course, for the choir, a double ambulatory. You'll recall that the ambulatory surrounds the choir area, and there's an aisle around the apse and behind the high altar. If you're not familiar with those terms yet, I encourage you to read the material in the book. And this really defined what came to be known as the Gothic style, especially as it pertained to Gothic architecture. It's interesting that in the beginning, it really started as a word designed to ridicule this particular style. Gothic meant barbarian or rude, but later in history, like so many other terms, it lost its negative connotation. People don't think about that anymore, and that's just a term used to refer to a particular style. And so we see a big contrast here between the Gothic style and the Romanesque style. The Gothic style sought higher structures, and this great height that they could build it to was made possible by new technologies. Without the technology, it wouldn't have been possible to do it. So things like the flying arches, the spires, the greater height with less bulk, that's still very popular even in buildings today. This all started with Gothic architecture. Here's a picture. Note the interior of the Nowens Cathedral. It's an older Gothic architecture. It has 4 levels, and notice the thick walls, and the arches are not quite as pointed as we're going to see later on. They're rounded off, but this style is still used very much today in cathedrals and things of that nature. Now here you can see the later Gothic style, a more pointed arch up there at the top. This is the interior of the upper chapel of La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. This, like most of these cathedrals, housed relics that would attract the pilgrims. Notice the skeletal architectural walls. They really have a terrific visual effect, and it framed so many windows, and we're going to see the significance of the stained glass window in Gothic architecture later. It could support windows up to 60 feet wide, which is a remarkable accomplishment for this point in history. And the idea here was to make it as bright, or we want to use the word luminous, luminosity, and do that as much as possible, not just from a practical standpoint, because they didn't have electric lights back then, but the spiritual significance that we'll get into more later, in that Jesus is the light of the world and God is light, these kinds of things that were really had an effect on people and could actually teach people. The Gothic cathedral was said to be a Bible in stone because people couldn't read back then, but you could learn from these stained glass windows and the stories that were told on them. Again, more on that to come. Let's get into a little bit more in depth, though, on the mysticism of light and the idea of building these cathedrals with these stained glass windows that would let in so much light. The luminous quality of these Gothic cathedrals should be very evident to you. It really underscores and supports Suger's theology of beauty. There's this idea of the Neoplatonic philosophy, the purity of light, and Platonic ideals that are a part of Plato's thinking, that every created thing partakes of the essence of God. So there's a hierarchy of existence. There's light at the very pinnacle of things. So we see this with these beautiful stained glass windows. So the term lux nova comes into play. This is Latin for new light. So whereas in an early part of history, mosaics made with colored bits of stone would merely reflect the light, these stained glass windows focus the light directly, so they were much more vivid. They were thought to be much more superior in getting this point across than the Byzantine mosaics that we just mentioned. This was thought to be a Bible of the poor and really a metaphor for God. A person who couldn't read could still read a Bible in stone here in the windows. So this was thought to be the Bible of the poor. Here's a great example of it right here. This is a part of one of the stained glass windows in the Notre Dame Cathedral. This is the Lady of the Beautiful Window. Notice the characteristic painted arch frame. There we see it. That's a very big technique that's used in this type of art and architecture. Mary is depicted as being seated on the seat of wisdom. And of course, we all know the reverence that Catholics have for Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's repeated in the tympanum on the outside of the cathedral. So we see those kinds of things. We also see the idea that this is supposed to be exemplary or a moral example. It symbolizes Christ passing through Mary unaffected. In other words, even though Jesus was born of a human mother, he doesn't partake of any of the sinfulness of humankind. So just as the light passes unaffected through Jesus here, so Jesus comes from Mary unaffected by the sin nature. Here is the arch on the outside that we mentioned earlier. Note the various angels. We have a depiction of the seven liberal arts that we talked about last time. In the outer arch are the archvolt here. And then interestingly here in the lower left, we have Aristotle. Now you may be thinking, once again, what's a pagan writer doing in a Christian cathedral in the artwork there? Well, again, we have this synchronism that we've mentioned earlier, influence of Neoplatonism, that still influences churches to this very day. You've been influenced by it. I've been influenced by it, many times without even knowing it. And we're going to have a discussion assignment that deals specifically with that later. Now, again, if this is a Bible in stone, the idea of the cathedral is to teach and to edify. Remember that in the Middle Ages, it's thought that all learning and wisdom points ultimately to God. This seems overwhelming to the modern viewer. This involved a great deal of collaboration between the builders and the theologians because, again, it was said to be the Bible in stone. So we would see a history of salvation in the decoration. The stonemasons working in these particular projects would get their orders from the master mason, and they might work for weeks and months and sometimes even years on a stone or a group of stones, not having any idea of how that stone was going to be used. And you can only imagine when the cathedral was completed that one of the masons looks up at this monumental structure and says, "There's my stone." And now to see how it's used must have been so inspiring. They were just called to be faithful and work on their particular stone. One of the things that really seems out of place to many students and to many people in general are these gargoyles. They look so evil and so mysterious. What are they doing on what's basically a church building. Well, they have an interesting history also. As we look at them, these served a practical purpose as well as the idea of evil fleeing from the church, because you see, these functioned as gutters. You can see right here the groove that goes down the side of the gargoyle. And just as the gargoyles are funneling the water in scripture many times symbolizes chaos, just as they funnel the water away from this monumental religious structure, so the gargoyles are said to be evil fleeing from the church. We see the symbolism as well as the practical significance of it as well. There are many meanings in the Gothic cathedral. They're actually the predecessor of the modern day town square, as you see in the county seat of the main town in many counties. It functioned as the cathedral square, a place that housed the church courts and the civil courts. This was also the place that established the horarium. And you'll remember from an earlier chapter that the horarium was the daily and yearly life that was determined by the Catholic Church, by this particular chapter here in this cathedral staff. It had a great economic impact as well, because we've mentioned this idea of the pilgrimage, the pilgrims that would come from far and near to see the relics that would be housed in these cathedrals. And they would also conduct trade fairs and feast days. And this was big business for the local town, just like tourism provides big business for many cities even today. Guilds, by the way, were part trade union and part fraternal organization. The modern day university system stems from the idea of the guild. And so, since they were making quite a bit of money, they would be responsible for much of these prestigious donations that were made to the cathedral, to the Roman Church. Here we see one of the most impressive, the outside of the Chartres Cathedral. This is on my personal bucket list. Love to see this one day. Especially, you'll notice down here, here is the rose window of the Chartres, one of the most impressive stained glass windows that exists in the world today. Now, this next picture is not of the rose window. It does depict one of the winemakers of the time. This was donated by the Winemakers Guild, and so this would publicize their activities as well. You can see him hauling his wine here on the back of the cart and the horse. He's transporting his merchandise to be delivered to the people who will be purchasing it. Again, many meanings in the Gothic cathedral, great motivation to build them. There was theological and religious devotion, civic pride, socioeconomic interest. Interestingly, we don't know much about the actual design and construction. There are not very many papers or notebooks left. One of them, though, Villiard de Honeycutt's notebook, has survived, fortunately. It's one of the few surviving notebooks of the day. It's a stunning technological achievement. Remember that these cathedrals and even the idea of scholasticism of the day was meant to combine human knowledge and religious faith. The idea there, leaving the profane behind and entering the sacred. So the pilgrim really does become a central metaphor here, leaving the old stuff behind, going on to the new. So the pilgrim not only symbolized the pilgrim's visit to the cathedral, but symbolized our journey of life as a pilgrimage. The idea, as the Old Testament says, that we are strangers in a strange land. If you grew up in church, you probably remember the hymn, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." That's the idea that's evident in these cathedrals. That will conclude part 1 of chapter 10. We'll pick up next time with part 2.